The alarm on the bridge of the Velkan warship screamed through every corridor, and Commander Iyeth Sorn gripped the edge of his console as the small human outpost appeared on the main screen. It looked like nothing. A cluster of metal domes on a frozen moon, barely large enough to house a few hundred people. His orders were simple. Land, demand surrender, and claim the moon for the consortium before the humans even understood what was happening to them. He expected no resistance. The reports from the scouting drones had shown a colony with outdated shields and a handful of light defense turrets. This was supposed to be the easiest assignment of his career. 3 shuttles descended toward the surface, engines glowing against the black sky. Inside the lead shuttle, a young Velkan soldier named Threll checked his weapon for the 4th time, more out of nervous habit than necessity. He had heard stories about humans, mostly rumors traded between soldiers who had never actually fought one. Some said humans were clever. Others said they were desperate, backed into a corner of the galaxy with nothing left to lose. Threll didn't believe any of it. To him, humans were simply another young species who had not yet learned their place among the stars. The shuttles touched down on the icy plain half a kilometer from the outpost gates. Commander Sorn stepped out first, his boots crunching against the frost, and raised a hand toward the colony's comm tower, signaling for a peaceful surrender broadcast. For a moment, nothing happened. The wind howled across the open ground, carrying loose snow past the shuttle's landing lights. Then the colony's outer gate opened, and a single figure walked out to meet them. She was tall, wrapped in a thick gray coat, her boots leaving deep prints in the snow. Her name was Ellie Marsh, the colony's civilian administrator, and she carried no weapon, only a small data pad clutched against her chest. Sorn studied her through his helmet display, searching for signs of fear. He found none. Her expression was calm, almost curious, as if she were meeting a trade delegation rather than an invading force. "You are trespassing on consortium-claimed territory," Sorn said through the translator embedded in his suit. "Surrender this outpost, and no harm will come to your people." Ellie tilted her head slightly. "This moon was settled by humans 11 years ago. It was never part of your territory. And I think you should turn your shuttles around before this gets complicated for you." Sorn almost laughed. A single unarmed woman was threatening him, standing in the open with 3 warships worth of soldiers behind him. He raised a hand, ready to signal his troops forward, when the ground beneath his feet gave a faint, almost imperceptible tremor. It was so subtle that most of his soldiers didn't notice it at all. But Sorn had spent decades in combat, and he knew the feeling of something shifting beneath the surface of a battlefield, even when he couldn't yet explain what it was. "Last warning," Ellie said, her voice steady. "Leave." Sorn gave the order to advance. It was the last calm decision he would make that day. The moment his soldiers crossed an invisible line roughly 200 meters from the outpost wall, the terrain around them changed instantly. Panels of packed snow folded away to reveal shallow trenches that had been dug and hidden weeks earlier, camouflaged so perfectly that the scouting drones had missed them entirely. From these trenches came a wave of coordinated fire, not wild or panicked, but precise, aimed with an efficiency that suggested every soldier inside knew exactly where the enemy would be standing before they even arrived. Threll dove for cover behind a ridge of ice, his ears ringing from the sudden chaos. He tried to return fire, but every time he raised his head, a shot cracked past him with unnerving accuracy, forcing him back down. Beside him, another Velkan soldier attempted to flank left, only to trigger a small charge buried beneath the snow that knocked him off his feet without causing serious harm, a deliberate choice that Threll would later realize was meant to disable rather than destroy. The humans were not simply fighting to kill. They were fighting to control the battlefield completely, using every tool available to slow, confuse, and outmaneuver an enemy who still believed this would be an easy conquest. Commander Sorn tried to rally his soldiers through his comm channel, but the human forces had already jammed the frequency, cutting his units off from coordinated communication. Without orders, the Velkan soldiers scattered into disorganized clusters, each group fighting alone against an enemy who seemed to know their exact positions. From a ridge overlooking the battlefield, a small team of human soldiers led by a sergeant named Owen Bennett watched the chaos unfold below with a strange, quiet patience. "They still think this is going to be quick," Owen muttered to the soldier beside him, a young woman named Grace Hale who was tracking enemy movement through a scope. "Let them think that a little longer," Grace replied, adjusting her aim. "It'll make the retreat easier for everyone." The battle lasted less than 20 minutes, though to Commander Sorn it felt far longer. By the time he ordered a full withdrawal, nearly a third of his landing force had been captured or disabled, and not a single human soldier had left the safety of their trench network. As the shuttles lifted off the icy surface, Sorn stared down at the outpost through the viewport, trying to understand what had just happened. The consortium had faced hundreds of species before, some fierce, some clever, some simply too primitive to resist. But none of them had fought like this. None of them had turned a supposed act of surrender into a carefully planned battlefield. Back aboard the main warship, Sorn filed his report with a shaking hand, describing the engagement not as a defeat, but as an anomaly. He assured his superiors that the humans had simply gotten lucky, that their success was due to unfamiliar terrain and outdated intelligence about their defenses. He believed this explanation as he wrote it. He needed to believe it. The alternative, that this small, isolated colony of a few hundred humans had outmaneuvered a trained consortium force without losing a single soldier, was too unsettling to accept. Aboard the retreating shuttle, Threll sat in silence, replaying the battle over and over in his mind. He had expected to feel relief at surviving his first real engagement. Instead, he felt something closer to confusion. He had trained for years, studying tactics drawn from 100 successful campaigns against 100 different species, and none of that training had prepared him for an enemy who fought with such quiet, unnerving control. He thought about the moment a human voice had crackled briefly across a stolen frequency before the jamming took hold, calm and unhurried, giving instructions as though the entire ambush had been rehearsed a dozen times before it ever happened. Perhaps, he realized, it had been. Down on the icy surface, the outpost settled back into a fragile quiet once the last consortium shuttle vanished from the sky. Grace Hale walked the perimeter with a small team, checking the trench lines for damage and gathering equipment that could be reused or repaired. She said little as she worked, but her eyes kept drifting toward the horizon, toward the direction the enemy ships had gone. She understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in the outpost that night, that this quiet moon had just become a small, permanent line in a much larger story neither side had chosen to write, but neither side would now be able to walk away from. Word of the failed invasion spread quickly through consortium command channels, though most senior officers dismissed it as an isolated incident, a fluke born of poor planning rather than any real threat posed by humanity. Few of them paused to consider what kind of species could turn a routine skirmish into a lesson in humiliation. Fewer still wondered what would happen if a larger, more determined human force were ever pushed into a true war. On the frozen moon, as the consortium shuttles disappeared into the night sky, Ellie Marsh walked back through the outpost gates, her boots still crunching in the snow. Owen and Grace met her near the entrance, both still watching the sky where the enemy ships had vanished. "They'll be back," Owen said quietly. "With more ships next time." Ellie nodded slowly, tucking her data pad back under her arm. "Then we'll be ready again. But I don't think they understand yet what they just started." She was right. Somewhere far beyond that frozen moon, in the vast council chambers of the consortium, reports of the failed invasion were already being read, dismissed, and filed away as an unimportant footnote. No one in those chambers understood that this quiet, isolated skirmish on an unremarkable moon was the first spark of a conflict that would eventually force every species in the galaxy to rewrite everything they believed about humanity. Later that night, as the outpost's lights dimmed for the evening cycle and most of the defenders finally allowed themselves a few hours of rest, Owen stood alone near the outer gate, staring up at the stars. He thought about how easily the consortium commander had assumed victory, how confidently he had walked toward the outpost expecting nothing more than a formality. Owen understood that confidence would not disappear after a single defeat. If anything, it would return, larger and better prepared, determined to erase the memory of this small embarrassment. He also understood, with the same quiet certainty that had carried him through the day's fighting, that whatever came next, his people would be ready for it too. Somewhere far above him, unseen and unheard, the first reports of the encounter were already crossing the galaxy, carried on signals that would eventually reach ears far more powerful, and far more dangerous, than anyone on that frozen moon could yet imagine. 6 months after the failed invasion of the frozen outpost, the Consortium Council convened an emergency session that would change the course of galactic history. Delegates from a dozen member species crowded the circular chamber, their voices overlapping in frustration as reports continued to arrive from human territory. What had once been dismissed as an isolated skirmish had grown into something far more troubling. Human colonies, scattered and technologically outmatched, were refusing every diplomatic ultimatum sent their way, and worse, they were winning small confrontations that should have been impossible to win. At the center of the chamber stood Admiral Kayles Wren, a veteran commander who had spent 40 years expanding Consortium territory across 3 galactic arms. He had grown tired of hearing his colleagues debate the matter as if humans were a minor inconvenience. He requested full authorization for a decisive military campaign, one that would end the growing unrest before it spread further. The Council, eager for a swift resolution, granted his request almost unanimously. Within weeks, a massive Consortium fleet assembled at the edge of human space, dwarfing anything the young species could hope to counter. Analysts predicted total victory within a month. Human ships were slower, their weapons less refined, their numbers a fraction of what the Consortium could deploy. On paper, the war was already decided before the first shot was fired. The opening battle took place near a mining colony called Haldron Station, where a small fleet of aging human cruisers attempted to defend the region against an overwhelming Consortium assault. Captain Noah Fenn commanded the lead vessel, a ship far older than anything in the Consortium fleet, patched together from salvaged parts and stubborn determination. His crew had trained for this moment for years, running endless simulations of exactly this scenario, a numerically superior enemy bearing down with confidence born from decades of easy conquest. As the Consortium ships advanced, Admiral Wren expected the human fleet to retreat or surrender within minutes. Instead, Noah's ships scattered into a formation his tactical officers had never seen before, weaving between asteroid debris fields with a precision that made conventional targeting systems struggle to lock on. The humans weren't just avoiding fire, they were drawing the Consortium fleet into a narrow debris corridor where their larger warships lost maneuverability. "They're funneling us," Wren said quietly, watching his tactical display with growing unease. "This isn't panic. This is a plan." By the time the Consortium fleet extracted itself from the debris field, it had lost several vessels to a combination of asteroid collisions and precisely timed strikes from human ships that had been lying in wait along the corridor's edge. It was not a decisive human victory, but it was enough to delay the assault and force Wren to reconsider his approach. He ordered a full regrouping, determined not to underestimate his opponent a second time. Over the following weeks, the war expanded across a dozen systems, and a pattern began to emerge that unsettled Consortium commanders far more than any single battle. Human forces adapted with startling speed. Weapons technology captured from early skirmishes was reverse-engineered and improved upon within days. Tactics that failed once were never repeated. Soldiers who lost ground in one battle returned weeks later having learned from every mistake, refining their strategies with a relentless, almost obsessive determination to never make the same error twice. On the ground, the war took on a different character entirely. Ground assaults against human colonies revealed a species that fought with a mixture of discipline and improvisation unlike anything Consortium forces had encountered. A young lieutenant named Mia Turner led a defense unit on the colony world of Ashen Ridge, where Consortium ground troops attempted to seize a critical supply depot. Outnumbered nearly 3-1, her unit held their position for 11 days, using the planet's dense forests and shifting weather patterns to their advantage, striking swiftly and retreating before consortium forces could organize an effective counterattack. What struck consortium soldiers most was not simply the tactics humans employed, but the way they carried themselves in combat. Interrogation reports from captured human soldiers described a calm resolve that seemed almost unnatural to consortium psychologists. Most species, when faced with overwhelming odds, showed clear signs of fear or desperation. Human soldiers, even in dire circumstances, often remained focused, calculating, and unwilling to abandon their positions or their comrades. A consortium field medic named Ves Orlin, assigned to study captured human wounded for medical intelligence, later reported an incident that troubled her deeply. A young human soldier, severely injured after a failed ambush, refused sedation until he had relayed tactical information to his commanding officers through a hidden communicator sewn into his uniform. Only after ensuring his unit had received the intelligence did he allow himself to lose consciousness. Ves had treated soldiers from dozens of species throughout her career, but she had never witnessed that particular combination of discipline and self-sacrifice before. As the war progressed into its second year, Consortium High Command grew increasingly frustrated by their inability to secure a lasting advantage. Despite superior numbers and technology, every major offensive against human territory resulted in disproportionate losses. Admiral Wren, now leading the primary consortium war effort, began compiling detailed reports on human combat behavior, hoping to identify a weakness that could finally bring the conflict to a swift and favorable conclusion. It was during the siege of Corvin Pass, a narrow mountain valley controlling access to 3 major human colonies, that Wren witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. A small human garrison, cut off from resupply and reinforcement after a successful consortium flanking maneuver, found themselves trapped in a fortified position with no realistic hope of rescue. Wren expected a quick surrender. Instead, the garrison held the pass for 6 days, repelling wave after wave of consortium assault troops despite dwindling supplies and mounting losses. Wren personally observed the final assault from a command ship orbiting above the valley, watching through satellite feeds as his forces closed in on the human position. He fully expected to witness the garrison's collapse. Instead, he watched as the surviving defenders, led by a sergeant named Lucas Pierce, launched a coordinated counterattack during the final hours of the siege, using the last of their equipment to destroy a critical consortium supply convoy before retreating through a hidden tunnel system that consortium scouts had failed to detect. The garrison escaped with the majority of its remaining soldiers, having inflicted losses on the attacking force that far outweighed their own. That night, Wren sat alone in his private quarters aboard the command ship, reviewing the battle data in silence. He had commanded countless campaigns across his long career, and he had never seen a defending force fight with such calculated ferocity while facing certain defeat. It was not simply that humans refused to give up. It was the way they refused, methodical and precise, turning every apparent disadvantage into an opportunity to inflict maximum cost on their enemy. Wren began to suspect, though he did not yet fully understand why, that the consortium was not fighting a young, disorganized species desperately defending its territory. They were fighting something far more dangerous, an enemy whose instinct for survival had been forged through a history of conflict that the consortium had never bothered to study. He ordered his intelligence officers to compile every available record of the tunnel network Sergeant Pierce's soldiers had used to escape, curious how such an elaborate system had gone entirely undetected by consortium scouts for so long. What he found only deepened his unease. The tunnels had not been dug in haste during the siege itself. Engineering timestamps recovered from damaged equipment suggested the network had been quietly constructed months earlier, long before any consortium force had approached Corvin Pass, built on the assumption that a siege might one day become necessary. It was not a desperate improvisation born of crisis. It was preparation, patient and deliberate, for a moment its builders hoped would never come, but planned for anyway. That realization troubled Wren more than the battle itself. An enemy who fought fiercely in the moment could be predicted, eventually worn down through repeated pressure. An enemy who prepared years in advance for conflicts they had not yet been forced into was something else entirely, a species that treated vigilance itself as a permanent condition of survival rather than a temporary response to immediate danger. As reports of battles like Corvin Pass and Ashen Ridge spread throughout Consortium territory, a quiet unease began to settle among the soldiers and officers involved in the war. Veteran troops, who had once approached the conflict with the same confidence Commander Sorn had carried onto that frozen moon over a year earlier, now spoke of humans with a different tone entirely. Respect, mixed uneasily with something closer to apprehension. Back on Earth, far from the front lines, military analysts studied incoming reports with grim satisfaction rather than surprise. Humanity had entered this war outmatched in nearly every conventional measure, but they possessed something the Consortium had not accounted for. A willingness to adapt without hesitation, to learn from every failure without complaint, and to fight not merely for territory, but for the simple, unshakable belief that surrender was never truly an option. As the second year of the war drew to a close, Admiral Wren requested additional forces from the Consortium Council, warning that victory would require far greater commitment than originally anticipated. His warning was met with skepticism from council members who still believed the war could be won through sheer numerical superiority. Wren, increasingly convinced otherwise, began quietly preparing contingency plans for a conflict that might last far longer, and cost far more, than anyone in the Consortium had ever imagined. He also began keeping a private log, something he had never done during any of his previous campaigns, recording his own observations alongside the official battle reports submitted to the Council. He wrote about the calm in Ethan Cross's interrogation transcripts, the discipline in Lucas Pierce's final counterattack, the strange, unsettling patience that seemed to define nearly every human soldier he had studied so far. He did not yet have a full explanation for what he was witnessing, but he suspected, correctly, that understanding it would matter more than any single battle fought over the coming years. He requested, through careful and quiet channels, that a specialist be assigned to study the matter properly, someone capable of looking past the battlefield reports and into the deeper questions his own military training had never prepared him to answer. Dr. Vesa Island had spent most of her career studying the psychology of species across a dozen star systems, cataloging behavioral patterns that helped the Consortium govern its many worlds with minimal conflict. She had written extensively on cooperation, hierarchy, and communication among newly contacted civilizations, and her research had once been considered essential reading for any officer assigned to first contact protocols. When Admiral Wren summoned her to his command ship 2 years into the war, she assumed she would be asked to help negotiate a diplomatic resolution. Instead, she was handed a stack of classified reports and a single, unsettling request. "I need you to explain them to me," Wren said, standing at the edge of his tactical display, watching a holographic map of contested territory flicker between shades of red and blue. "Not their weapons. Not their ships. I need to understand why they fight the way they do." Vesa spent the following weeks buried in data. She reviewed hours of recovered communications between human soldiers, studied captured medical records, interviewed prisoners through translated dialogue, and pored over historical archives that Consortium intelligence had gathered from early human broadcasts. What she found troubled her far more than she expected, not because the information was frightening in itself, but because it revealed a species whose relationship with conflict was unlike anything she had studied before. Most species the Consortium had encountered approached warfare as an extension of resource competition, a rational calculation of costs and benefits that could be predicted and managed through sufficient force or negotiation. Humans, she discovered, approached conflict through an entirely different lens. Their history, stretching back thousands of years before they had even developed space travel, was saturated with conflict of every conceivable kind. Wars fought over land, over belief, over pride, over survival itself. Unlike other species who had largely moved beyond internal conflict once they achieved technological unity, humans had carried the instincts of that long, violent history directly into the stars. She began compiling her findings into a report, starting with something she called the loyalty pattern. In battle after battle, human soldiers consistently prioritized the safety of their companions over their own survival, even when logic suggested retreat was the wiser choice. This was not entirely unique among sentient species, but the intensity and consistency of the behavior stood out. Vesa reviewed dozens of incidents where wounded human soldiers refused evacuation until every member of their unit had been accounted for, where commanding officers placed themselves in greater danger to cover the retreat of subordinates, where soldiers risked capture rather than abandon fallen comrades on the battlefield. She interviewed a captured human soldier named Ethan Cross, who had been held in a consortium detention facility for several months following a failed offensive. Through a translator, she asked him why he had stayed behind during his unit's retreat, allowing himself to be captured rather than escaping with the others. "Someone had to hold the line while they got out," Ethan said simply, as if the answer required no further explanation. "You risked your freedom, perhaps your life, for people who were already safe," Vesa pointed out. Ethan looked at her with an expression she struggled to interpret, somewhere between confusion and quiet certainty. "That's not really a choice most of us think twice about." Vesa recorded the exchange carefully, noting that similar sentiments appeared repeatedly across dozens of interviews. Whatever drove this behavior, it did not seem to be a calculated military strategy imposed from above. It appeared to be something deeply ingrained, a cultural and perhaps even biological inheritance shaped by countless generations of conflict where survival often depended on the willingness of individuals to protect the group above themselves. Her research led her next to what she termed the adaptation pattern, the unsettling speed at which human forces adjusted their tactics after every engagement. She cross-referenced hundreds of battle reports spanning the first 2 years of the war and found a consistent trend. Human units rarely, if ever, repeated a failed strategy. Weapons technology captured or destroyed in one battle would reappear in modified, improved form within weeks. Defensive positions that fell to a particular consortium tactic were rebuilt using countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize that exact approach the next time it was attempted. Vesa consulted with consortium engineers who had studied captured human equipment, and their reports echoed her own findings. Human technology, while generally less advanced than consortium standards at the start of the war, was evolving at a pace that defied conventional expectations. She began to suspect that this rapid adaptation was not merely a product of clever engineering, but reflected something deeper in human psychology, an almost compulsive drive to solve problems, to never allow a single failure to remain unaddressed. She recalled a passage from an old human historical text that had been translated for consortium archives, describing a period referred to as an industrial age, during which human civilization transformed itself dramatically within the span of a single century, moving from simple mechanical tools to complex machinery capable of reshaping entire landscapes. The pattern, she realized, was not new. Humans had always responded to challenges, whether environmental, technological, or military, with an intensity of innovation that few other species could match. War, for humans, was simply another problem to be solved, and they approached it with the same relentless determination they had once applied to surviving harsh winters, crossing oceans, and understanding the physics of their own universe. The third pattern Vesa identified was perhaps the most difficult for her to fully articulate, even to herself. She called it the acceptance of cost. Throughout her career, she had studied species that fought fiercely to protect their territory or their people, but always within limits shaped by an underlying desire for self-preservation. Humans, she found, operated under a different calculus entirely. In battle after battle, human commanders made decisions that seemed to accept devastating losses as a reasonable price for strategic gain, provided that gains served a purpose the soldiers themselves believed in. She studied the siege of Corvin Pass extensively, reading through Admiral Wren's own detailed account of the battle, and found herself particularly struck by the actions of Sergeant Lucas Pierce, who had led the final counterattack during the garrison's escape. Military logic suggested that Pierce's forces, already low on supplies and heavily outnumbered, should have surrendered rather than risk a counterattack that offered little strategic advantage beyond delaying the inevitable retreat. Yet Pierce had chosen to strike anyway, inflicting maximum damage on the pursuing consortium force before extracting his surviving soldiers. When Vesa reviewed recovered communications from Pierce's unit during the final hours of the siege, she found no evidence of desperation or panic. Instead, the recordings revealed calm, methodical planning, soldiers discussing the counterattack with the same measured tone one might use to plan a routine supply run. This unsettled her more than any display of aggression could have. It suggested that for these soldiers, extreme risk and potential sacrifice were not exceptional circumstances requiring extraordinary courage, but simply an accepted part of how conflict was conducted. She began to draft a theory, cautious at first, but increasingly confident as more evidence accumulated. Human soldiers did not fight primarily out of fear of consequence, nor purely out of loyalty to a distant government or cause. They fought because their entire evolutionary and cultural history had shaped them into a species uniquely suited to conflict, one that treated hardship not as an obstacle to be avoided, but as a condition to be endured and overcome through collective effort and stubborn resolve. Vesa requested permission to interview additional prisoners, hoping to test her theory further, and was granted access to a small group of captured human soldiers being held at a remote consortium research outpost. Among them was a woman named Grace Hale, the same soldier who had fought alongside Owen Bennett during the very first skirmish on that frozen moon 2 years earlier. Grace had been captured several months into the larger conflict after her unit was overwhelmed during a prolonged engagement near the outer colonies. Vesa approached the interview differently than her previous ones, choosing to ask Grace not about specific battles, but about her life before the war began. Grace answered honestly, describing a childhood spent on a struggling agricultural colony where resources were often scarce and survival required constant effort from every member of the community. She spoke of learning to operate machinery before she could properly read, of helping neighbors rebuild after a devastating storm destroyed half the settlement when she was still a child. "Nothing about my life before the military was easy," Grace said, her voice steady despite her circumstances. "You learn pretty quickly that things don't get better because you wish they would. They get better because you work through them, even when it's hard, even when people around you get hurt along the way." Vesa asked her directly whether she feared death in battle, and Grace considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I'd rather not die," she said honestly. "But I've made peace with the idea that it might happen, if it means the people I care about get to keep living their lives. That's just how it works." Vesa asked one final question before ending the interview, curious whether Grace held any resentment toward the consortium for starting a war that had cost her so much, including her own freedom. Grace considered the question carefully, glancing briefly toward the small barred window of the detention room before answering. "I don't spend much time on resentment," she said. "It doesn't fix anything, and it doesn't get anyone home faster. I'd rather spend that energy figuring out how to be more useful the next time it matters." Vesa noted the answer carefully, recognizing it as another expression of the same underlying pattern she had already documented dozens of times before, a refusal to dwell on grievance when there was still work to be done. It was, she began to realize, not merely a personal trait unique to a handful of exceptional soldiers, but something closer to a shared cultural instinct, passed down and reinforced across generations long before any of these individuals had ever considered a career in the military. The simplicity and sincerity of Grace's answer struck Vesa deeply. She realized that what she was witnessing was not a carefully cultivated military ideology imposed through training, but a worldview shaped from childhood, reinforced by a culture that valued perseverance, sacrifice, and collective survival above individual comfort. Humans did not need to be taught to endure hardship for the sake of others. It was woven into the fabric of how they understood their place in the world, long before any of them ever picked up a weapon. Vesa compiled her complete findings into a report for Admiral Wren, structuring her conclusions carefully to avoid alarming consortium leadership unnecessarily, though she knew the implications of her research were deeply unsettling. she explained that the consortium was not simply facing a determined enemy defending its territory. They were facing a species whose entire history had prepared them, consciously or not, for exactly this kind of prolonged, costly conflict. She warned that conventional military strategies, designed to break enemy morale through overwhelming force or attrition, were unlikely to succeed against a species that had already demonstrated a willingness to endure extraordinary hardship without breaking. She suggested that any lasting resolution to the war would require a fundamental shift in approach, one that acknowledged humanity not as a young species to be subdued, but as a formidable and deeply resilient civilization whose resolve could not be easily worn down through traditional means. When Ren finished reading her report late one evening aboard his command ship, he sat in silence for a long while, staring at the same tactical display he had studied countless times before. He thought of Corvin Pass, of the calm, deliberate counterattack that Pierce's soldiers had executed against impossible odds. He thought of the frozen moon where this entire conflict had begun, and the quiet certainty in Ellie Marsh's voice as she warned him that the consortium did not yet understand what it was starting. For the first time since the war began, Ren allowed himself to consider a possibility he had avoided facing directly. Perhaps victory, in the traditional sense the consortium understood it, was not achievable against an enemy like this. Perhaps the only realistic outcome of this war was an ending neither side had originally intended, one shaped not by conquest, but by mutual exhaustion and a grudging, uneasy respect earned through years of costly, hard-fought conflict. He called Vesa back to his command ship the following morning, and when she arrived, he asked her a single question that would shape the remainder of the war effort. "If we cannot break them through force," he said quietly, "how do we end this war before it costs us everything?" Vesa considered the question for a long moment before answering, choosing her words carefully. "You do not end a war like this by breaking their resolve," she said. "You end it by convincing them the fighting no longer serves the people they are trying to protect. Everything I have studied tells me that is the only argument they will ever truly listen to." Ren absorbed her words in silence, turning them over in his mind long after she had left the room. He understood, perhaps for the first time since the war began, that the coming years would not be decided purely through superior firepower or clever strategy. They would be shaped by a slower, harder question, one that no amount of military training had ever prepared him to answer. How does a civilization convince an opponent that peace serves them better than victory, when that opponent has already proven, again and again, that they are prepared to endure almost anything rather than accept defeat? Vesa did not have an easy answer, but she understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in the consortium at that time, that the war they had started was no longer a simple campaign of conquest. It had become something far more complicated, a test of endurance against a species whose resolve the consortium had never truly understood until it was far too late to turn back. The colony of Brannock Hollow sat on the edge of human territory, a modest settlement built into the sheltered valleys of a mountainous world that had little strategic value beyond its position along a critical supply route connecting three larger human systems. For most of the war, it had remained largely untouched, too small to justify a major consortium offensive, too remote to warrant heavy defense from human command. That changed in the third year of the conflict, when Admiral Ren, still searching for a decisive advantage, identified Brannock Hollow as the key to severing human supply lines permanently. He committed a significant portion of his remaining fleet to the assault, believing that a swift, overwhelming strike against a lightly defended colony would finally deliver the kind of victory the consortium desperately needed to shift momentum in their favor. Intelligence reports estimated the colony's defense force at no more than 200 soldiers, a fraction of the numbers Ren intended to deploy. On paper, it seemed like an easy target, exactly the kind of decisive engagement that could finally break the stalemate that had defined the war for years. What Ren did not know was that human command had anticipated exactly this kind of strategic calculation. Recognizing Brannock Hollow's importance to their supply network, they had quietly reinforced the colony months earlier, though not with additional troops in any significant number. Instead, they had transformed the surrounding mountains into an elaborate defensive network, using the terrain itself as their greatest weapon. Hidden bunkers, reinforced tunnels, and carefully placed sensor arrays turned the valley into a fortress disguised as an ordinary settlement. Command of the defense fell to Major Ryan Cole, a soldier who had fought in nearly every major engagement since the early days of the war, including the desperate defense of Ashen Ridge alongside Mia Turner years earlier. Ryan understood better than most that Brannock Hollow could not be defended through conventional means alone. With limited soldiers and no hope of significant reinforcement, he built his strategy around patience, precision, and the willingness to trade immediate tactical losses for long-term strategic advantage. When consortium scout ships first detected unusual troop movements near Brannock Hollow weeks before the assault, Ryan made the deliberate choice not to reinforce the colony's visible defenses. He wanted the consortium to see exactly what they expected to see, a modest settlement lightly protected, ripe for an easy strike. Behind the scenes, his soldiers spent every available hour preparing the mountains for what they knew was coming. The assault began at dawn, consortium shuttles descending through the thin mountain air in overwhelming numbers, escorted by warships positioned to provide orbital support. Wren watched from his command vessel as the initial wave of troops landed near the colony's outer perimeter, expecting minimal resistance based on the intelligence his officers had gathered. For the first several minutes, that expectation seemed accurate. Human defenders offered only scattered resistance, falling back steadily toward the settlement's center as consortium forces advanced with growing confidence. It was a trap, though not the kind Wren had encountered before. Ryan's forces were deliberately drawing the invading army deeper into the valley, funneling them along a predetermined path that led directly into the heart of the mountain defense network his soldiers had spent months constructing. By the time consortium commanders realized the human retreat had been a calculated maneuver rather than genuine collapse, their forces were already committed deep within the valley, surrounded on all sides by terrain that offered little room for maneuver or retreat. The counterattack, when it came, was devastating in its precision. Hidden artillery positions built directly into the mountainside opened fire simultaneously, targeting predetermined coordinates where consortium troops had been funneled. Soldiers who scattered for cover found themselves caught in a network of tunnels and trenches specifically designed to trap and isolate smaller units, cutting them off from reinforcement while human defenders systematically neutralized each pocket of resistance. Wren ordered immediate reinforcement, committing additional troops in an attempt to salvage the rapidly deteriorating situation. Every reinforcement wave met the same fate as the first, drawn into the same carefully constructed kill zone, unable to break free of the terrain that Ryan's forces had transformed into their greatest advantage. Hours into the battle, Wren finally understood the scale of the miscalculation. Brannock Hollow had never been a lightly defended colony. It had been a carefully disguised fortress, waiting patiently for an enemy confident enough to walk directly into its trap. Despite the overwhelming tactical success of the ambush, Ryan's forces remained vastly outnumbered, and as the battle stretched into its second day, the cost of holding the valley began to mount significantly. Supplies ran low. Communication with outside human forces became increasingly difficult as consortium ships tightened their blockade around the system. Ryan understood that his soldiers could not hold the valley indefinitely, but he also understood that every hour they continued to resist bought critical time for human command to reposition their fleet and prepare a broader counteroffensive elsewhere along the front. On the third day of the siege, with ammunition and supplies dwindling rapidly, Ryan gathered his remaining officers for what many of them privately believed would be their final briefing. Among them was Lieutenant Chloe Vance, a young officer who had distinguished herself throughout the battle by coordinating the tunnel network's defense with remarkable efficiency despite mounting losses. Ryan laid out their situation honestly, without exaggeration or false reassurance. Their position could not hold much longer through conventional defense alone. "We're not looking for a way to win this outright," Ryan told his officers, his voice steady despite the exhaustion visible on every face around him. "We're looking for the best way to make sure this costs them everything it possibly can, for as long as we possibly can." Chloe proposed a plan that had been quietly developing among the junior officers over the previous day, a coordinated strike using the last of their heavier equipment to target the consortium's forward command structure directly, rather than continuing to defend static positions that were slowly being worn down through sheer attrition. It was an enormous risk, one that would leave their remaining defensive positions dangerously undermanned, but if successful, it could disrupt consortium coordination enough to force a temporary withdrawal, buying crucial time for reinforcements that human command had promised were finally on their way. Before the strike team departed, Ryan walked the length of the forward tunnel to speak with each soldier individually, a habit he had carried through every major engagement of his career. He found Chloe checking her equipment one final time, her hand steady despite the exhaustion visible in her eyes after 3 days of near-constant fighting. "You don't have to lead this one yourself," Ryan told her. "I could send someone else." Chloe shook her head without hesitation. "I planned it. I know the tunnels better than anyone else left standing. It has to be me." Ryan studied her for a moment, recognizing the same quiet resolve he had seen in dozens of soldiers throughout his years of service, the kind that could not be ordered into existence, only recognized and trusted when it appeared. He nodded once, offering no further argument, and stepped aside to let her team move forward into the storm. Ryan approved the plan, fully aware of the danger it posed to everyone involved. That night, under cover of darkness and a sudden mountain storm that reduced visibility to almost nothing, a small strike team led by Chloe moved through hidden tunnels toward the consortium's forward command position, carrying the last of their explosive charges and portable weapons systems. The storm, rather than hindering their approach, provided perfect cover, masking their movement from consortium sensors still calibrated primarily for clear weather conditions. The strike succeeded beyond what even Ryan had dared to hope. Chloe's team destroyed a critical communications relay and several key vehicles positioned near the consortium's forward staging area, throwing their entire command structure into temporary disarray. In the confusion that followed, consortium forces mistakenly believed they were facing a much larger counterattack than the small strike team actually represented, leading several units to pull back defensively rather than press their numerical advantage against the weakened human positions. Ren, monitoring the chaos from his command ship, made the difficult decision to order a temporary withdrawal from the valley floor, intending to regroup and launch a more coordinated final assault once his forces had re-established proper communication and organization. It was, in effect, exactly what Ryan's forces needed. The brief withdrawal gave the exhausted defenders precious hours to consolidate their remaining positions and prepare for whatever came next. Word of the strike spread quickly through both consortium and human forces, though the two sides understood its significance very differently. For consortium soldiers, it represented a deeply unsettling demonstration of human willingness to take extraordinary risks even when facing near-certain defeat, launching an assault that offered no guarantee of success beyond disrupting their enemy's coordination for a limited window of time. For human forces, particularly those who had followed the battle from afar through limited communication updates, it became a powerful symbol of resilience under impossible circumstances. On the 5th day of the siege, exactly as Ryan had hoped, human reinforcements finally arrived, a modest but well-coordinated relief force that had been quietly repositioned during the chaos following Chloe's strike days earlier. Their arrival, combined with the exhausted and disorganized state of the consortium forces still recovering from their earlier withdrawal, proved decisive. What remained of the consortium assault force, already having suffered devastating losses attempting to break through Ryan's defensive network, found itself unable to sustain a prolonged engagement against a now reinforced human position. Ren, faced with mounting losses and a rapidly deteriorating strategic situation, made the difficult decision to order a full withdrawal from the system entirely, conceding Brannock Hollow to human forces after 5 days of brutal, costly fighting that had cost the consortium far more than the colony's limited strategic value could ever justify. As his remaining ships retreated from the system, Ren reviewed the final battle reports in stunned silence, struggling to reconcile the scale of the defeat with the overwhelming numerical advantage his forces had possessed at the beginning of the assault. News of the battle spread rapidly across both consortium and human territory, though its impact resonated far beyond the immediate strategic consequences of the engagement itself. Throughout consortium military circles, Brannock Hollow became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the danger in underestimating human resolve, no matter how limited their numbers or resources might appear on paper. Officers who had once viewed the war with growing confidence now approached every engagement against human forces with newfound caution, wary of hidden defenses and unexpected countermeasures that had come to define human military strategy throughout the conflict. Among human forces, the defense of Brannock Hollow became something closer to legend, retold and remembered not simply for its tactical success, but for what it represented about the character of those who had fought and survived it. Stories of Chloe's storm strike, of Ryan's calm determination throughout 5 days of relentless siege, spread quickly through human colonies as a symbol of what their people were capable of when pushed to the absolute limit of endurance. Perhaps most significantly, the battle marked a subtle but crucial shift in how other species throughout the galaxy began to perceive humanity. News of the engagement reached far beyond consortium military channels, circulating among neutral observer species who had, until that point, largely dismissed the human consortium conflict as a minor regional dispute unlikely to affect the broader galactic community. Reports of a small human force turning overwhelming defeat into a costly, humiliating withdrawal for one of the galaxy's most powerful military powers began to draw attention from civilizations who had never previously considered humanity worth studying closely. Slowly, quietly, across dozens of worlds far removed from the actual fighting, a new understanding of humanity began to take shape, one built not on assumption or prejudice, but on the accumulating evidence of battles like Brannock Hollow. Humans were not simply a young, technologically limited species struggling to survive against a superior enemy. They were something far more formidable, a civilization whose resolve, adaptability, and willingness to endure extraordinary hardship made them an opponent that even the most powerful galactic powers underestimated at their own considerable peril. Weeks after the withdrawal, Chloe stood at the edge of the valley, looking out over ground still scarred from days of fighting, and found Ryan beside her, both of them silent for a long moment before he finally spoke. "They'll study this one for years," he said quietly. "Try to figure out exactly what we did right, so they can avoid it happening again." Chloe considered the ruined mountainside, thinking of the friends they had lost holding this ground, and the storm that had carried her team safely through the dark toward a strike that should never have succeeded. "Let them study it," she said finally. "It won't matter. We'll just find something new by the time they think they've figured it out." Ryan allowed himself a rare, tired smile, understanding that she was right. It was not any single tactic or strategy that had carried them through 5 days of impossible siege. It was something harder to copy, harder to counter, and far more dangerous for any enemy to face, a willingness to keep adapting, no matter the cost, for as long as it took. For years after the first shots were fired on that frozen moon, the war between humanity and the consortium had settled into an uneasy, exhausting rhythm that neither side had originally anticipated. Neither force possessed the strength to deliver a decisive, war-ending blow, and both had grown weary of a conflict that continued to consume resources, soldiers, and territory without any clear path toward final victory. It was in this atmosphere of mutual exhaustion that Admiral Wren received an unexpected summons back to the Consortium Council chambers, where the political mood had shifted dramatically from the confident optimism that had launched the war years earlier. The council chamber, once filled with delegates eager for swift conquest, now carried a heavier, more cautious energy. Reports from across the front had painted a consistent, troubling picture over the previous year. Every major engagement against human forces, regardless of numerical or technological advantage, had resulted in losses far exceeding initial projections. Colonies that should have fallen within days had instead required weeks or months of costly siege warfare, often ending in consortium withdrawal rather than victory. The war, originally framed as a swift campaign to secure valuable territory, had instead become one of the most expensive and demoralizing conflicts in consortium history. Wren stood before the council, delivering a report he had been quietly preparing for months, one built not around strategies for eventual victory, but around a careful, honest assessment of what continued conflict would ultimately cost. He spoke of Brannock Hollow, of Corvin Pass, of dozens of smaller engagements where human forces had turned seemingly impossible situations into costly victories or, at the very least, damaging strategic setbacks for the consortium. He spoke of Dr. Vesa Island's research, explaining to the assembled delegates that humanity's resilience was not a temporary anomaly, but a fundamental characteristic shaped by their entire history as a species. "We are not fighting an enemy who can be worn down through attrition," Wren told the council, his voice carrying the weight of years spent studying an adversary he had come to respect deeply, despite the immense cost that respect had demanded. "Every defeat teaches them something new. Every loss makes their next defense more effective. We could commit every remaining resource the consortium possesses to this war, and I believe, with real conviction, that we would still find ourselves facing a species that refuses to break." The council debated his report for weeks, divided between delegates who still believed total victory remained achievable through sufficient commitment of resources, and those who had grown increasingly convinced that continuing the war indefinitely would ultimately weaken the consortium far more than any territorial gains could possibly justify. Eventually, exhausted by years of mounting losses and diminishing public support across member worlds, the Council authorized Wren to pursue a diplomatic resolution, the first serious attempt at negotiated peace since the conflict had begun. Negotiations began cautiously, conducted through neutral intermediary species who had watched the war unfold from a careful distance. Human representatives, led by a diplomat named Sophie Lane who had spent years coordinating humanity's wartime alliances with sympathetic neighboring civilizations, approached the talks with the same calm, measured determination that had characterized human military conduct throughout the entire conflict. She made no attempt to exaggerate humanity's position or demand terms beyond what circumstances reasonably justified. She simply made clear, through careful and deliberate negotiation, that humanity would continue resisting indefinitely if the alternative meant surrendering territory or sovereignty they had spent generations building. During one of the final negotiation sessions, held aboard a neutral station orbiting a quiet, uninhabited world, Sophie found herself seated across from Wren directly for the first time since the talks had begun. Both had spent years shaping the war from opposite sides, and both understood, perhaps better than anyone else present, exactly how costly this moment of quiet negotiation had been to reach. "Your people never once asked for terms beyond what was fair," Wren said, studying her carefully across the table. "Even when your position could have demanded more." Sophie folded her hands calmly in front of her. "We were never fighting for more than what was already ours," she replied. "That was always the whole point. We just needed you to understand that we'd defend it for as long as it took." Wren nodded slowly, recognizing in her simple answer the same quiet resolve he had witnessed in battle reports for years, unwilling to escalate beyond what circumstances required, but equally unwilling to yield an inch beyond what was reasonable. It was a lesson, he realized, that summarized the entire war more accurately than any tactical analysis his officers had ever produced. The final treaty, signed nearly 5 years after the initial skirmish on that frozen moon, established clear boundaries between human and consortium territory, along with formal recognition of humanity as an independent galactic power rather than a subordinate species subject to consortium authority. It was not the sweeping victory some human commanders had once hoped for in the war's earliest, most uncertain days, but it represented something far more significant than territorial gain alone. It was formal, undeniable acknowledgement that humanity could not be conquered, subdued, or dismissed as an insignificant player among the galaxy's established powers. In the years following the treaty's signing, the story of humanity's war against the consortium spread far beyond the immediate parties involved, becoming a subject of careful study among military academies and diplomatic institutions across dozens of civilizations throughout the galaxy. Species who had never engaged directly with either side found themselves re-evaluating long-held assumptions about strength and power in galactic politics, recognizing that raw numbers and advanced technology alone did not guarantee victory against an opponent whose resolve simply refused to diminish under pressure. Dr. Vesa Ireland continued her research long after the war's conclusion, expanding her original findings into a comprehensive study that became required reading throughout consortium military and diplomatic institutions. Her work outlined, in careful detail, the psychological and cultural factors that had made humanity such a formidable adversary, emphasizing lessons that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of their conflict. She argued convincingly that any civilization, regardless of technological standing, that possessed humanity's particular combination of adaptability, collective loyalty, and willingness to endure hardship for the benefit of others represented a threat that could never be safely underestimated, no matter how limited their initial resources might appear. Admiral Wren, now retired from active command, occasionally lectured at consortium military academies, sharing first-hand accounts of the war with young officers who had only ever known humanity as an established, respected galactic power rather than the struggling young species he had once dismissed as an easy conquest. He always closed his lectures with the same warning, delivered with the quiet conviction of someone who had learned its truth through years of costly, hard-fought experience. Never assume calm means weakness, he would tell them. Never mistake patience for hesitation. And never, under any circumstances, believe that a smaller force has already lost simply because the numbers tell you they should have. On Earth, the war's legacy took shape differently, woven into cultural memory not as a triumphant celebration of military conquest, but as a solemn reminder of what had been sacrificed to secure humanity's place among the stars. Memorials were built in dozens of cities, honoring soldiers like Owen Bennett, Grace Hale, Ryan Cole, and countless others whose names had become woven into the broader story of humanity's improbable survival against overwhelming odds. Schools taught the history of the war not to glorify conflict, but to emphasize the values that had ultimately carried humanity through it: patience, loyalty, adaptability, and an unwavering refusal to abandon those who depended on them. Grace Hale, released from consortium custody following the treaty's signing, eventually returned to civilian life, though she remained connected to military service for years afterward, training new generations of soldiers in the same principles that had defined her own service throughout the war. She rarely spoke publicly about her experiences, preferring instead to let her actions during training speak for themselves, but on the rare occasions she did share her thoughts, she offered a simple, unadorned perspective that captured something essential about humanity's approach to the entire conflict. "We never set out to prove anything to anyone," she said during one of her infrequent public appearances, years after the war's conclusion. "We just did what needed doing, for the people standing next to us. If that ended up meaning something bigger to everyone else watching, that was never really the point." Throughout the wider galaxy, humanity's reputation continued to evolve steadily in the decades that followed the war's conclusion. Civilizations who had once viewed humans with the same dismissive indifference the consortium had originally shown began approaching diplomatic and military interactions with a markedly different tone, one shaped by careful respect rather than casual assumption. Trade negotiations, territorial disputes, and diplomatic exchanges involving human representatives increasingly carried an underlying awareness that humanity, despite their relatively young status among established galactic powers, possessed a resilience that made them an exceptionally poor choice for anyone considering conflict as a means of resolving disagreements. Military academies throughout the galaxy, including several belonging to species who had never directly encountered humanity in combat, began incorporating case studies of the war into their standard curriculum, using battles like Brannock Hollow and Corvin Pass as essential examples of how determination, adaptability, and collective sacrifice could overcome seemingly insurmountable disadvantages in both technology and numbers. Young officers across dozens of civilizations learned humanity's story not as a warning against a specific enemy, but as a broader lesson about the limits of assuming any opponent could be easily measured through numbers alone. Decades later, a young consortium officer named Threll, the very soldier who had crouched behind an icy ridge during that first chaotic skirmish so many years earlier, found himself unexpectedly assigned to lead a diplomatic security detail during a formal consortium visit to a human colony world. Standing at the edge of a bustling human city, watching civilians move about their daily lives with the same calm confidence he remembered from that frozen battlefield decades before. He found himself reflecting on how dramatically his understanding of humanity had changed since that first, humiliating defeat. He thought of Commander Sorn, long since retired, who had spent the remainder of his career quietly studying human culture and history, eventually becoming one of the consortium's leading experts on human diplomatic relations. He thought of Ellie Marsh, whose calm warning on that frozen moon so many years ago had proven more prophetic than either side could have possibly imagined at the time. Later that evening, reviewing the day's security schedule in his quarters aboard the visiting delegation ship, Threll found an old archived recording buried in the consortium's historical database. The original calm transcript from that first encounter on the frozen moon, Ellie Marsh's calm voice warning Commander Sorn to turn his shuttles around before it became complicated. He listened to it twice, struck by how little her tone had differed from the calm, steady voices he still heard in every modern human broadcast: diplomats, engineers, soldiers, all carrying that same unhurried certainty that had unsettled consortium forces from the very first day of contact. It was not arrogance, he understood now. It never had been. It was simply the quiet confidence of a people who had never doubted, even in their most vulnerable moment, that they would find a way to endure whatever came next. Standing there, decades removed from that first chaotic engagement, Threll finally understood something that had taken the entire consortium years of costly conflict to fully appreciate. Humanity's strength had never come from superior weapons or overwhelming numbers. It came from something far harder to measure, and far more dangerous to underestimate: a collective refusal to break, no matter the cost, no matter the odds, no matter how impossible victory might have seemed at any single moment along the way. And across the galaxy, in council chambers and military academies alike, that lesson endured long after the last shots of the war had faded into history, a quiet, permanent reminder etched into the collective memory of every civilization who had ever underestimated the resolve of human soldiers, and paid the price for that mistake.